talk about the houses in astrology, we're not talking about structures that are built on Earth, but instead we're talking about the natural spatial demarcations of the sky in relationship to the horizon and in relationship also to the meridian. Those 2 points in the horoscope are the only 2 real points in space. The horizon, as it extends outward into space, intersects at some point a degree along the ecliptic or a degree along the horizon, and that is called the ascendant. And for the simple reason the ascendant is called that is because that is where planets appear to rise. In actual fact, what is happening is that the Earth is turning, and as it turns, the sky appears to rise up and will present at predictable times in predictable places the same fixed point or the same fixed star. The extension of this horizon into space on either side allows us to divide the celestial dome into half, into a hemisphere, so that the upper half of the sky in an astrological chart represents the daylight hours. And of course, everything under the horizon is going to represent that which is not seen, or the night part of the horoscope. So the horoscope is 2 hemispheres, one of which is above, as above, and one of which is below, as below. But there's also the eastern and the western hemisphere. Now, the divisions of the horoscope into these different hemispheres is quite natural. And the first division is the one that goes below the ascendant and the horizon, or the one that rises above. And that, of course, is the subjective under the horizon, and the objective, which is above the horizon. When you're demarking the horoscope into hemispheres from east to west, we're demarking the part of the chart that is on the eastern horizon as being the oriental or the eastern hemisphere. And the western hemisphere is stressing the western half of the horoscope, which is where planets appear to set. Now, the division of the sky into space, different spaces, was created in order to be able to symbolize our realms of experience into individual segments. In a sense, it brings the sky down to us in a personal way. It's the need to see human activity in relationship to celestial movement. And the houses themselves, the divisions of this space into 12, the only real points, as I mentioned earlier, are the ascendant, horizon, and the meridian or the midheaven. That is the guidepost of even celestial navigators. Everything in between, all the intermediate house cusps, are in fact mathematically induced. They aren't necessarily real, and in fact caused quite a consternation among scientists and astrologers alike. So I see them as being basically mathematical hallucinations. However, the division of the circle into 12 is a natural phenomenon. So how we divide that circle into 12 is entirely up to the individual who wishes to explore or use different house systems. But the 2 points, the meridian at the top of the horoscope and the ascendant at the side on the eastern horizon, are the only 2 real mathematical points. And when we are relating the horoscope in houses formation, what we're talking about is the gradual development of cycles of activity that are related to each other by process. In some way, this system is very familiar, and it's very related to the actual order of the natural signs, Aries through Pisces. The ascendant in the chart is determined by the exact time of birth. That's why an astrologer will plague their client, prospective client, to find out exactly what time you were born. Because the sun will remain in the same degree of the sky for a whole 24-hour period. The moon will spend about 13 on the average degrees in a 24-hour period, and every planet out from the sun a shorter and shorter duration. So what fixes the horoscope? What is it that creates the uniqueness of a horoscope? Even to the untrained eye, in the course of a 24-hour period, the sky takes on quite a different image. From the point on the eastern horizon in the horoscope, that demarks a section of the sky that if you were to be aware and cognizant and were to look due east at the time of your birth, you would then see on the horizon, on the ascendant or ascending, a particular sign. This is only determined by the time of day because the sun itself actually marks where and what time it is. That's how we've been able to deduce when it's noon. And the old sundial is one of the old ways of demarking time because it indicated when the sun would have been as close to directly overhead as it ever will get. So the houses are a result of being aware of this natural demarcation of the sun's movement and what it brings with it on the eastern horizon depending on the latitude of your birth. So again, we're looking at a situation where the sun is the determining factor. And in order to be able to set up an accurate horoscope, one must have this very crucial time. Once that is established, what do you do? Now that you've cast it, what do you do with it? You're sitting there looking at what I can only call a personal mandala. And mandalas have been used in all the religious writings and all spiritual writings and greatly used in any Jungian analysis. Mandalas are clear indications of your center, where you're operating from, and your extenuating points. And there's one very old graphic that clearly illustrates this of the body of a human, of a man, in the circle, in this sort of stance, you see. And what that represents is the outreach of the horizon to the east and the west, and the upright position of the backbone as we are planted firmly on terra firma. And from that point on, it's all very symbolic rather than being directive. Now, the ascendant, when you first begin to study astrology, is often described as what you look like. This has always bothered me because there's a great deal of myself that is very rational and demands explanation. And I've never found it quite comfortable to conceive of the genetic background of, say, a woman who is in process, in labor, about to give birth, and you look at your watch and you get the time and the astrologer is casting up the horoscope and it's like 28 degrees of Pisces rising, which simply means that due east on the horizon, the 28th degree of Pisces is presenting itself, which is supposed to represent a person with large luminous eyes, thick hair, and, well, what happens if, say, for some, act of God, the birth is delayed upwards of 10 minutes? What you end up with at that point upon delivery is 1 or 2 degrees of Aries rising, which I find very difficult to understand that the genetic pattern is somehow altered in that 10 or 15 minutes, so the person who is then born is no longer a large, luminous-eyed, thick-haired person, but a redhead with a widow's peak. Now, this does not make sense. What does make sense, however, is that the point on the ascendant is your mask or your persona, how you project yourself out into the world, how you receive the impact of environment upon your natal pattern or your horoscope. So that if we're talking about spatial orientation and it's like the psychic overtone or the way you receive your environment, over time, this point on the horizon at the ascendant will be emphasized repeatedly by your environment. So what it does is it sets up a psychological predisposition towards responding to things in a particular way, so that you will then become or evolve over a period of about 30 years toward this type of appearance, so that your genetics are still very much who you are, who you look like. You look like your Aunt Mary or you look like your grandmother, but you have receiving your environment in only your way, in a totally personal and totally specific and very, very unique way. The repeat of that every year as the sun returns to its position every year. For instance, the moon goes through every sign in the course of a 29-day period. So that would indicate that within the first year of your life, 13 times the moon has moved over the ascendant area, thereby restating over and over again your emotional responses to situations. So that by the time you're a year old, there's been 13 lunar transits. There will have been one solar transit. By the time you're 2, Mars will have gone over there. By the time that you're 12, you've had a Jupiter transit. In the course of 30 years, the transit of the planet Saturn has marked 4 times an angular relationship to your horizon and to your meridian. As a result, by the time you're 30, you are basically who you will be. The way you have psychologically experienced your environment will, in a sense, predetermine your appearance so that you may actually become more like the rising sign or the ascendant as time goes on. The first house in astrology has always been associated with personality. Well, this is because you're projecting outward a persona or a way of being. Why are you projecting this outward? Because you are feeling a certain way inside. So that it's kind of a very well-balanced situation that you are feeling this way because it's a little bit like the chicken and the egg. You don't know which came first. And this has always been, something that I ponder philosophically in my spare time is the horoscope an indication of predisposition, or are you responding from this central point? So there is a lot of room for thought and discussion in this area, but it still divides the ascendant, descendant axis, and the meridian and the nadir of the horoscope divides the horoscope into 4 sections. They're not even. In fact, depending on your latitude, they can be quite different. But there are always going to be polarities. The width of the first quadrant, one of 4 sections, will always be the same as the third quadrant, and vice versa. So as the first house is an indication of who you are in time and space, fixes you here in this planet, the second house would be the follow-up to that. So we think in terms of the first house of the horoscope as being the house of vitality and projection and your will and how you display yourself and what other people see when they look at you. It's not necessarily who you are, but it's what they see. It leads into the second house, which symbolizes your desire or your need to become something of worth, something of value. In fact, self-worth is essential in order for creative production. And in the second house of the chart, we look at it as if it were the development of self-worth and the kind of incidents that occur in your life that back that up, so that whenever there is anything in that house area, a planet, or if there is a transit to the second house, the motion of a current planet in relationship to the natal chart, it emphasizes and amplifies your need to be involved with ego-building activities. Now, as we talked earlier on planets and we talked about signs, each of these houses is going to have one of the signs, possibly 2, but we'll talk in terms of one of the signs on each of these house cusps. The sign that is on the cusp of the house is descriptive of the nature that it's like the key to the door to that realm of experience. Because the houses are symbolic of our need to relate our daily activities in some cyclic form. And in fact, the development of self is very rhythmic and very cyclic. So the sign ruling the second house, or that's sitting on the second house of the chart, is a key to how you need to learn to develop your self-worth, your stable points, and your capacity to equate yourself as a valuable object, as an asset, if you will, in the world. Now, in analysis, we like to look at the second house as being the inherent self-worth, that which is usually adapted from the parents and how the parents have given you a sense of belonging. The second house is by nature a house that is very practical. It's a house that follows from the first. In astrology, the first house of any quadrant, in other words, the first, the fourth, the seventh, and the 10th, are called angular houses because they are the first step. It's a sharp demarcation from what has been and what will now become. So the first house is more of an initiatory step. The second house is maintenance of values and maintenance of skills, and the rendering practical and the testing ground for your personality. So that when we're looking at the concept of the second house, the space that it occupies has more to do with your personal assets, which you will then be able to take and invest later in another part of your life, represented by another part of your chart. Do this later on. And so this leads into the third house. Now the second house is called succeedent because it follows. But it's also a very fixed situation. So the houses, as they go in order, one of them initiates, the other one maintains the situation, and the third one of a quadrant adjusts or adapts in the way which environment will then demand. So there's a firmness of purpose upon arrival, let's say in the first house or in the ascendant area, and a description of what's to be. Then there's the establishment of it in the second house, and a ritualized establishment of it usually implies that one undergoes fluctuations of self-worth, self-questioning, self-doubt. And the sign on the second house is very descriptive of how one performs, say, self-analysis or self-criticism. Some of us are more prone to it than others. Some of us are more locked into some of the more self-destructive aspects of self-analysis. This would be very likely a combination of inherent predisposed tendencies along with that validated by the early home environment. So what we're looking at is a combination of things. We're not looking at a horoscope which will tell you who this person is or what they're going to do. It tells you what their basic pattern is, and then if that is, the negative parts are validated in the early home experience, then we will be seeing the more negative aspect. But there's always the positive side. And the positive side is the one that should be enhanced. It doesn't mean that one ignores the negative side or the problems that have been there in self-development or in learning about what you're worth or what your values are. And in the old books, you'll see that the second house represents money and movable possessions, which is interesting because some people definitely relate their value and their worth to what they have in their pocket or what the car they drive or the house they own. So you see, some people are very much tied into their personal worth and their bank account. Now, depending on who you're talking to and whose horoscope you're looking at, for instance, if you were looking at a nun or a monk who had rejected material worth, you could not possibly relate their second house to their financial statement, could you? You would have to then say, well, I wonder what this person's self-worth means to them. So it's an objective and it's also a subjective thing. It is not engraved in stone. Now, the third step in development is the capacity to communicate. And the third house is often called early childhood, brothers and sisters, local trips, short journeys. And this is what one does is a child extends themselves out into a very short area. In other words, their first relationships are usually with siblings. Their first relationships on a peer level are with siblings or next door neighbors or children within a short period of time away. So that the development of ideas and the development of communication is usually done within the confines of the home. So it's very frequent that the third house in the chart will describe the kind of adjustments that have had to be made mentally in order to feel that they can communicate and receive information in a sensible way. Because the third house is called a cadent house, and in cadent, cadency in music, for instance, means to fall away. So what it is, it's like the culmination in the second house of self-worth, and then you make all these adjustments in the third house as to how you might be able to utilize this in reality, in real life, in communication. People almost always reveal themselves in body language. They're very, very reflective when it comes to speaking or talking. Body language is what I call bottom line communication. And for all of your words and however you present yourself, there's always going to be this sort of emanation that comes out that people say, well, I feel this about this person, even though they don't say that. That's basically your third house coming out. So you're projecting. Your body language is located in the third house. because this tells the truth. This house communicates who you really think you are. Now notice how I said who you think you are, which is not necessarily who you really are. But it certainly is something that is workable and adjustable. Because if you have, say, had extremely negative input as a child, and you are then basing all of your concepts on this erroneous input of information, you will find that as you become more evolved along the self-development lines, things become increasingly complex, and it can all be sourced back to the third house as far as your original data. So I like to look at the third house as the initial input of data into the body, which is the mind, which is the computer, and how that is processed. Now, we all know that if you put incorrect data into a computer, you will never get the correct answer. So if a person bases their philosophy and their whole ideology on erroneous information or on a difficult information at childhood, they can actually become increasingly distorted. Errors are magnified the further they get away from the source. Now, you see, what we've done is covered what is called the first quadrant, the first 3 houses of the horoscope. And the first quadrant is very closely related to the intuitive. And the intuitive is the part of our mind that is not psychic. I don't mean that. Intuitive is the inherent knowledge that is there within you. That at the time of your birth, you have an unconscious blueprint for knowledge that you will base things on. So in fact, that whole concept of time beginning for you at the moment of your birth is graphed. You are a walking memento of that time. So time and space unite in circumstance through the houses. So the first quadrant represents very basic primitive functions. These are things that you just are born with. We start to move into more environmental experiences when we move through the bottom part of the horoscope, the nadir, and into the 4th house, the 4th section. Now remember, I have said that the ascendant area, the nadir as well, is one of the fixed points. This is a very real place. This is the extension of the meridian down to the bottom of the chart, moving into what's called the 4th house. It's a cardinal house. It's also a water house. So there's a lot of emotional background in this house. The 4th house has to do with the whole concept of the collective family unconscious. Because we go back to origins so distant that we could never reach them except through very, let's say, focused types of meditation or focused types of hypnosis or through trance or through dreams, we can connect with our racial memory, our historic past, our original parents. So that when we are in a state of creating our environment, for instance, astrology is often called the 4th house, your home, and your family, and also the early home environment, but the early home environment as a protective covering, as your lodging. Now, home has a lot more resonance to it than your house on your street. Home has some mystical, luminescent quality to it that can bring tears to your eyes if it's said at the wrong time or in the wrong way. There's a button that can be pushed where home becomes a very painful thing, where what you basically want to do is go back there, but what is it? What is home? Home isn't your address. It's how you recreate in order to make yourself more comfortable on this plane, recreate an environment in which you then feel comfortable. So that the 4th house is, yes, your home, and often will describe the house. The sign on the cusp of the 4th will often describe the type of furniture that you like, how you keep your house, whether you love housekeeping or whether you hate it, what comes first, housekeeping or creativity. Very frequently reflected in the 4th house. But it really is a recreation of what we feel is our racial historic memory, and so that it is a collective memory. It also provides the basis, because the 4th house cusp is like where you have your feet planted on the ground. This is where you need stability. Where your feet are in fact the basis of your whole reality. And then you can only, if you're off balance, it can often be shown in the area of the 4th house in a horoscope, just exactly where is this insecurity coming from? How can we deal with it or perhaps make it more comfortable for us? So very often the 4th house is used as a vehicle to get to the bottom of what could be an insecurity that could be changed or created in a different way through some form of analysis. The water houses are the collective, the unconscious, and the subconscious houses. And the 4th house is the first key to your past. Without a base of operations, without the security that is necessary to function and to perform, and that is there for us to create out of, we would not have a 5th house. You see, each house is, as each sign, a direct relationship from the previous house and in preparation for the next one. So the 5th house, which is another succeeding house, as was the 2nd, has a lot to do with the fruitfulness of security. So if you don't feel secure, then how can you feel that you have anything to offer or to give? The 5th house in the old textbooks is called children, creative energy, love affairs, speculation. I mean, this is a real motley group of influences. This is not something that is easily tied in the beginning stages of studying astrology. And yet if you allow yourself to think back over what these symbols really mean, what is actually happening is that the 5th house represents your capacity to give love or time or money. It simply means your capacity to invest, whether that is time, love, or money. It is very much related to the 2nd house of personal assets. So if you don't think you're worth much, then you won't have much to give. So it does date back to the early development of personal worth and assets. Now, the 5th house as a, let's say, as a metaphor for creativity on a biological level, in other words, children, it's the easiest thing for us to create. You see, there doesn't require a lot of thought or a lot of intellectual training or anything like that in order to have children. It is the primary urge of creativity, which is why often women in later stages of pregnancy are incapable of an original thought. A lot of this is because the creative energy, the hormonal change that goes on in the gestation period, a lot of that creativity is going into the child. Now, if you're involved in a love relationship, you have to invest something in it, don't you? There's always the possibility that they might leave you or that they don't love you or they could die. I mean, it's always possible that these things can happen, which is why we have to look at the houses as investment potential. So if there's something in the 5th house, or the sign ruling the 5th house indicates that there may be, a little touchiness or some problems in investing time or love or money, then you can work on it in that way. The key will be the sign on the cusp of that house. So that you can actually pull that house apart and take a look at where they might be able to invest their time, love, or money in a way which would produce for them the kind of return that they need. But with all of these things, there's going to be a risk, obviously. So with anything that you invest, there's that potential, but you have to invest something to get a return. So, better to have loved than lost than to never have loved at all, as they say. And this is really true, because if you don't put something in, then you'll never get something out. So locked within the symbolism of the 5th house is our need to create for ourselves something new based on what we have within. So that's why we can say that our relationships are very much what we give, what we make them. And that being a succeeding house is a constant quality. This is something that is going to be always there. It is not fluctuating very much. You can change the quality perhaps. You can't really change the predisposition. You're going to go about your life in a certain way. However, you can do almost anything else you want with it. But the creativity does lead into creating some order, which occurs in the 6th house. Now, the function of the 6th house is a sum and total of the first 5 that we talked about. It's as if you are creating your environment in the 1st house. You're establishing your self-worth in the second house. In the third house, you are learning to communicate or to express ideas or to interconnect with other people and to come up with your own conclusions that will be in some way, shape, or form an indication of what type of security you need at the very base of your life, which then gives you sort of the security in order to go out and experiment and create some new ideas. But all of this is all very esoteric. It's not very physical. And without a body, you're not going to be able to do any of it. And Virgo, the sixth house, and that part of the chart winds up the whole subjective experience. The sixth house of the chart represents the body as a vehicle for the soul and the mind. So as a result, your physical body is going to be, on one hand, largely determined by, again, family, heredity, genetics. But the condition of your body is going to be determined by your attitude. Now, your body essentially is your investment in the physical plane. It is with your body that you can move around, that you create things. It is the expression of your inner needs, your inner values, how you feed it, how you treat it, how you cover it. What you do with it is all an externalization on a physical level of the internal processes to date. So that every single step up to the sixth house, which is almost always related to as the health in the old books, and also work, service, and job, all of which sounds very dull, but it isn't, because we need that sense of satisfaction of being useful, being used. You know, most people's problem is that they are not being used properly in their work, for instance. People don't mind working, but they don't like to be used in a way that's inappropriate for them. So that's why we can look at the sixth house as your job. The sixth house is a house that is a Caden house, which means it's falling away. In other words, it's in the sixth house that you can make a number of adjustments with your environment in order to fulfill something more important inside. It's a projection. It's also the vehicle of expression. So that what we can do with the sixth house is turn it into something that is really a physical embodiment of our inner self. It takes time, and it also means taking a chance, a risk. But we've already talked about how in the fifth house is where we determine just exactly how much risk should we be taking. Now remember, we're talking about this in personality, so that not everyone should be a high-risk investor. No, some people are real cautious. They should be. So that if I'm talking about somebody's chart to them, I don't want to project my values or my risk-taking abilities or my needs in a job on them. Some people would rather have a 9-to-5 where they didn't have to think, and then they go home and they write poetry or they play their musical instrument, and so their work is simply something to do in order to make some money so they can just live and be creative on the side. Now, some people couldn't stand that. Some people have to have something that literally personifies them. But that isn't everyone. So we have to remember that locked within this map is a person who is simply living out a particular pattern, and how may they do it more comfortably. Now, when we get to the sixth house in a horoscope, this is even more clearly defined than when we're talking about the progression of the signs, because this is literally the under half of the chart, going from horizon to horizon. And it expresses the subjective part of your nature, the part of you that is just strictly your own attitude. When we start moving above the horizon, we begin to experience others. We begin to experience ourselves in relationship to other people. I look at the seventh house as the testing ground of personal experience in relationship with other people. It's like you emerge above the horizon in a state of desire to share, and it being the seventh house, it being the polarity to the first house, we're looking at a polarity of self, first house, and others, seventh house. And this is all related very much to the fact that the second quadrant, as I described the first quadrant as being your intuitive self, the part of you that is inherent, that feels things on a deep level, is not necessarily intellectualizing this at all. It's very much part of your primitive self, your inherent nature. The creative quadrant, which is the second quadrant from the nadir to the descendant of the chart, expresses more the creative qualities. So it is the creative quadrant in the horoscope, because it is a direct result of your personal intuitive experience. But when we move above the horizon and into the seventh house range, into the third quadrant, which is, by no accident, the same size by degrees as the first quadrant, it's the polarity. It's integration. This is where you learn and you experiment with integrating yourself with other people, which, believe me, can be a real challenge. So that when you have your first relationship, for instance, your seventh house is working in gear, it's starting to gear up, you're beginning to look at other people and see how you might be able to fulfill yourself. The mark of maturity is when you begin to realize that when you're looking at other people that you're close to, they are a mirror of you. So that if you're walking around in a relationship with somebody that you can't stand, and you actually know this to the degree that you can complain about this relationship to someone, what you're doing is you're voicing your disapproval of yourself in a very real sense. Because each of us engages in relationships with other people because they strike a point of familiarity. There are millions of people in the world that I don't know, for instance. And there are millions of people in the world that you don't know. How come? There's a lot of people that you've met and there was no real click, there was no bond that was struck immediately. Why? Because they aren't familiar. They aren't you see. So what we do in the seventh house is we see ourselves in the mirror. And the seventh house is an angular house, so it's your first step into relating with other people. It's an experiment. It is your first step above the horizon of experience, heading towards that whole meridian. So that what we see along that descendant line and the sign that rules the seventh house is very often descriptive of the kind of people that you attract. Now, you don't have to be a victim of fate in this situation, sort of hapless citizen, why me? You can have some control. And by control, I don't mean manipulation, okay, in a negative sense. Manipulation is actually a neutral force until it's, used in an individual sense. But you can discover more about yourself by looking into the mirror of your friendships and your relationships. And it's a real touch point to be able to see yourself in balance with someone else. In fact, most of us feel somewhat incomplete if we don't relate in some way, shape, or form to someone else. We like to share, and that's the seventh house. When it becomes representative of fear and insecurity, this is probably because the first house is not well developed, your sense of self. In the books, the seventh house represents others, and it's the polarity, and we are a bipolar universe. So therefore, we experience things in twos. The seventh house, once it evolves and becomes the eighth house, what we're looking for there is not breadth of experience, we're looking for depth, because the eighth house represents depth of experience. It also represents the risk that one takes in intimacy. Now, the eighth house of the horoscope has been called sex, death, and taxes, which I found almost impossible to understand first. Then I realized, well, sex is taxing, death is ultimately the tax on life, and integration, merger, other people's money or other people's resources is also part of the eighth house. So it's like the king's ransom, this type of thing. But it's also that if you don't have a solid sense of your own ego or your own self-worth, which is the second house, then how can you possibly take the risk of merging your resources with someone else to the extent that you may even become the same person or a corporate entity, that you are in fact taking a tremendous risk. So you have to have a fairly firm sense of self-worth, a fairly firm base of operations. You have to have something to invest, don't you? So it's very much related to the second house and the fifth house as the capacity for investment. The eighth house represents the risk we take in merging our ego, our personal egos, with the ego or the resources of someone else. So those houses, you can see, are in many ways directly related to signs. And as we go through them, you can note in your minds that they seem to describe something very familiar. So that when we get into the 9th house, after we talked about the 8th house as being the ultimate experience of procreation and regeneration, and the result of sex is immortality, because we are immortal through our offspring, through our children, and they will recreate, and we live forever. But in order to do that, you actually have to give up a certain amount of your own personal ego and your own personal identity, at least in order to enjoy the function of reproduction, the very least. But in order to have that act complete, it must merge wholly to become one thing. So the 8th house is definitely one of the high-risk houses. But it's a house which promises tremendous depth and tremendous emotional reward. It also is the step just prior to forming a belief system, which is what the 9th house is all about. So the 9th house in the horoscope, that sector of the chart, finalizes this 3rd quadrant, which is the integration quadrant, the capacity to interact and integrate with other people, and especially one other person, in the case of the sexual aspect of the 8th house. It has that very basis that we need, that sense of unity, that sense of merged resources, to give us a sense of real beliefs. And the intensity of the experience of the 8th house usually results in some kind of, desire to understand what is going on. Now, you can understand what's going on if you look deeply enough, but if you don't pull back, and if you don't check out your range of activity and measure it against society, for instance, or measure it against other people's beliefs, we're all tied together in some way through our belief systems. But they are very much the result of the 8th house function, which I call the Freudian house, because it has to do with the layers of the unconscious mind, the 8th house, that can be peeled back like the onion to reveal deeper and deeper motivation. So the 8th house is, yes, risk, but it's also motivation. What gets you to do things? Why do you act this way? You can reach your 8th house through conventional analysis, through Freudian analysis, if you will, because it will take you back to your sort of primordial origins, which are really fairly primitive, unicellular experiences, and then you can develop, through analysis, the different ideas that you have been operating under. You can actually eradicate a lot of ideas that are not working, that are erroneous in your life, by facing the various layers of the subconscious mind. So when we get into the 9th house, which is bound to be, the result of this in-depth and very tiring experience too, by the way, very taxing the 8th house can be. When you get through this, you have to come up with something to live, something to create life for you, something that will bind us all together. And in fact, the 9th house is often called foreign trips, long journeys, communications from afar, the higher mind. Okay? The higher mind implies a lower mind. It implies an initial kind of mind, which we see in the 3rd house, its opposite point. So that's your functional data processing mind. And the 9th house has more to do with your educational abilities, your capacity to understand more complex systems, your capacity to connect and network with other cultures. You can create for you the possibility of travel in order to self-discover. It can also allow you to become more deeply involved in metaphysical aspects, because your mind is going to go beyond the mundane. In fact, in the old days, Sagittarius and the 9th house region and the planet Jupiter were very much related to the church. And wealth is associated with the church in the old days. And we were wealthy as a community according to our feudal lords and our affiliations in the church sense, in the spiritual sense. So the 9th house is also our capacity to philosophize and to connect ourselves through a belief system. And it is the house of bigotry as well, because this is where you can get locked into your belief system and you don't see anybody else's. So it's interesting that we think that the ninth house is philosophy and religion and the higher mind, but can also lock you into a belief system that is not necessarily the correct one for you. So you may have to change your philosophy from time to time, which makes sense because people do go through evolutionary changes in their belief systems. And with this idea and the concept and the freedom of being able to travel to other lands or to other places and to other psychic places, traveling does not always have to be on a plane or in a car. It can actually be by sitting in your chair and reading a history book. So what we're talking about here with long distance communication doesn't necessarily have anything to do with literally buying a ticket and going somewhere. It has to do with expanding your horizons so that you can include the philosophies and the systems of others. But the ninth house as a philosophical house is going to be directly related to the third house, which was your original information. So let's say this, if you were receiving as a young person really negative information, like let's say you were raised in an alcoholic environment or something along this line, very brutal or difficult, okay, very little understanding, you're going to start forming your belief system on this premise because you don't know any other precedent. You will operate all of your life within reason with this premise, which means that you're going to form, when we get to the sixth house, the other communication house, you're going to form a very, very complex type of analysis that will help you survive. The will to live is incredible. You will do almost anything. Your mind can schism, it can separate, it can diffuse, it can do all sorts of things to keep you alive through a situation, no matter how difficult it is. So just think if you're basing the analyses, your rational part of your mind, on erroneous input, just think how distorted your belief system would be as a result. So that your third house of I think leads into the sixth house of I analyze, which leads into the ninth house of I believe, is going to be somewhat distorted based on the original input. So you can use these houses to trace any kind of communication problems that might be apparent in your life or in other people's lives by tracing them back to original input. And that quadrant where the ninth house finishes off, that quadrant is your capacity to integrate with other people. So this is very, very intimate. And so as a result, it's a little more threatening because this is where you get close to other people and you get feedback from others as well. So the seventh house is your reflection in others. The eighth house represents the capacity for depth in relationship rather than breadth, and your psychological motivation. And the ninth house is, yes, your belief system and your code of ethics and that which keeps you upright, so that when we are being examined by the general public in the 10th house, because the 10th house is the meridian, and it is the whole meridian of experience, where the horizon of awareness and the meridian of experience intersect, there is going to be some kind of event take place. Now it's a transition from the third quadrant into the fourth quadrant, which means that you will have to begin to think in terms of, gee, now that I've come this far in life, I've developed my personal intuitive self and I've got some creative lifestyles and some things that I can do that really indicate who I am on a creative level. And I have experienced others, and I'm feeling that I've learned a bit about integrating myself. So now we have to move into the area that is called social expression, where you become socially involved and powerful. So the 10th house, the 11th, and the 12th are all involved in the area of life where you're asked to prove yourself. As a result, the midheaven is often called the career or the aspiration. I prefer myself to call it the point of aspirations, because this is where you sort of stand, feet on the ground, and it's like waving, hi, notice me. You know, this is what you aspire to be. So the sign and the degree on your midheaven is almost always an indication of, first of all, whether you want a career, because career is different than job, as we pointed out earlier, or whether you would rather not have a career, and that type of focus. At some point, most people are very conscious of something that they would like to do that will fulfill their purpose in life. Something that they can carry into the static world, 10th house, out of their 9th house, their belief systems. Most people do not want to take a job that vies with their belief system, really. So that if you're involved in a job that completely goes against all your ethics, you will probably get sick, which is the body's way of telling you, hey, you're not using the vehicle properly. So we're relating to the 10th house as if it were what you should do in order to act out your belief system in a way that society finds correct and that you find correct, that you could call your own personal status quo. So the 10th house is also how other people see you. It is not necessarily how you really are, nothing is, but it is how people will see you in your professional presentation. It is what you will do in order to become a professional. And it has to be backed up by your belief system. So we're looking at a real structure here. We're looking at the structure of your life so that you may then take some meat from this and move into the 11th house, which in the old books was called hopes and dreams and wishes, which is interesting because it's true. Because the 11th house is the polar opposite of the 5th, as the 4th house is the polar opposite of the 10th, on and on. So that when we base our career aspirations or how we want society to see us in the 10th house is always directly related to either the early home environment or the security factors in your home environment. In fact, you cannot really feel balanced if you're out of sync in either way. How many people have sacrificed home life for success in the career? How many people have completely ignored their 4th house in favor of their 10th house? Now, some people who are a little more balanced, they're not nearly as wealthy, but they've got a nice home life, say, gee, I wish I had, my 10th house was like that. I wish I were, as well developed in the 10th house. And yet, I've heard a lot of people who are very well developed in the 10th house who are just aching for a 4th house experience. In other words, a home security function. So if we keep all of these polarities in balance, we're going to find that we may not have such an abundance, but we'll have more balance, more reality. So the 10th house of the status quo is the backdrop to the 11th house of what you hope to receive. What do you wish? First of all, I like to call the 11th house your just desserts, simply because a lot of times we don't really want what we get. And there are a lot of times when people are more comfortable, for instance, with giving than with receiving. Well, we talked about the 5th house in the chart as being the primary function for learning to give love or give time or money or invest. So the 11th house, the polarity of that, the social expression of that, is to receive something back, to be able to hear the applause or to accept the compliment or to get what you really deserve. And you, believe me, will not get other than what you put in originally. You see, so we end up with a very nice cycle that culminates in the 11th house of social expression of our group associations even. You see, because when we talk about the 5th house, the polarity to the 11th, we talk about giving love or being involved with someone intimate. The 11th house is all your friends, all your acquaintances, the groups that you hang out with, the people that are your social reflection. They give you back what you give out. That leads into the final house, the 12th house, which I call the Jungian house because it's the house that you can reach through dreams and through trance state. It is the collective in a sense that we are all connected. We are all one in a collective sense. It is not the family unity. It's not the collective unconscious in the sense of the 4th house, which is our racial roots, our family history, our genetic code, our DNA. It's the collective family of mankind, of humankind. So the 12th house represents for us the thing that connects us all indelibly forever through dreams and through our myths. It's no wonder that Carl Jung was so involved with this concept, which is why I understand more about the 12th house if I express it in that way, because this is our connecting link with each other. This is our one thing that keeps us involved with each other on a racial level, but an interconnecting families, you see. So we all have, each of us, our origins, but we network within that to produce the 12th house experience, which is a purifying experience. And it is the place where you go to relax. It's the place where you go to space out and to dream and to create new visions. And it's the place where you can go in order to refresh yourself and to find out really who you are in amongst this network of humanity where one can get lost in a fog. So the 12th house is your result. It's your relaxation point. This is where you get some time off. I call it the downtime. And when you've spent 11 processes of development, getting to a point where you're getting some return in your life, but now you get some time off to become yourself. It is through the alembic of the 12th house that your philosophy becomes purified, perfect, and distilled. It's also an area that has often been called self-undoing, only because the causal images of the 12th house are the sum and total of your whole life experience to date, and all of the processes of development wind up in the 12th house to undergo the test of reality. If you're not living in a real situation, then the 12th house will become confinement for you. If you are facing your reality and you are allowing yourself unconscious downtime, then you will find the 12th house to be a release and an escape, a healthy one, rather than one that rips you off for the energy that you have been putting out for the previous 11 experiences. Now, these are repeated over and over. Life is a cycle. Development is a cycle. Things sound familiar, but they're never the same. And that's the beauty of the house system, is that for each person, it means something different, something personal. But you can guarantee that the 12th house is where you purify the daily activity and where you allow yourself vision and illumination.